Okay, let's talk about lenses. For the past year, I've been working on getting this plastic prototype adapter and taking it into a fully finished product. But what is this thing? Well, this is an anamorphic adapter. Anamorphics are basically a subset of wide-angle adapters that only stretch in one direction. Anamorphics really came to prominence in the middle of the 20th century. For many different reasons, anamorphics came to be as a way to squeeze more horizontal field of view onto a smaller piece of film. Back in February of 2021, my friend Piero, who runs the company PPP Cameras, contacted me as he had seen me make some lenses for my homemade rangefinder camera. I was using my small CNC machine and hand polishing them to an acceptable surface quality. Piero had been testing some of the available phone anamorphics and putting them on mirrorless and rangefinder cameras to see if he could get any good results out of them. He then asked me if I thought I could make an anamorphic adapter for this kind of purpose. And honestly, I had no clue. I knew a little bit about anamorphics, but really nothing concrete. I looked into all the books that I had and only found a few tidbits here and there, but enough to gather that it was essentially the same principle as a viewfinder, but cylinders instead of spheres. With that in mind, I set off on making a prototype. I think I finished the front lens within a week, and then I put the project on hold as I went back to university. In September of that year, I finally polished the rear lens and had a working prototype. I made a second, sent it to Piero, and used mine throughout the summer to make some fun photos. I didn't think too much of it, but Piero saw the vision and thought this can definitely be a fully fledged product, and started contacting some manufacturers to get quotes, but found it difficult to find someone who was willing to do a very small batch for us, so the project quieted down for a while. About a year after, in 2022, I finally put up a post about the lens on Instagram, which got a huge response to my surprise. But I was just about to start my master's, and so I once again put the project on the side, and honestly didn't think too much of it. Flash forward a year and a half to December 2023. I finished my master's back in July and had been teaching up until December, and I'm now done with it and looking for something to do. I put some work into getting quotes and find a manufacturer that's willing to make the lenses for us. I sent Piero a message asking if he would still be interested in this project and going halfsies on it with me. He immediately takes me up on the offer, and we're off to the races. The adapter is called the Alum Anamorphic. It's a 1.33x squeeze adapter with two pieces of glass. It's an extremely basic design with no moving parts, which means it's a fixed focus design. You can watch my other video for a little more in-depth explanation on it. So, what did I learn? In the first batch, the build was not too dissimilar from a prototype. It was a 5-piece build, front cover, housing, back clamp, 2 pieces of glass. This worked really well for the prototype, but in production had several issues. The first issue was mainly down to the clamping. The clamping was based off of designs I had seen like diopters for cinema lenses, where they clamp onto the outside diameter of lenses. It works really well in those cases as the adapters are quite thin, and also they clamp onto a very precise outside diameter. For this product, there were 2 issues. The adapter is quite long compared to the clamping space, and the outside diameters of filters vary. The clamp worked really well on my specific B plus W filter, but on any other generic type of filter or any other brand, it just wasn't as strong and could fall off. The second issue was that the lens itself was quite fragile. The protective bevels on the front lens specifically just weren't big enough. This meant that the lens itself could crack quite easily, either in shipping or in assembly. Okay, so what changed for the second edition? Adobe recommended a different kind of design with an inbuilt filter thread that would screw into the camera lens and then that could be locked. So change the rotation and then you can lock it. And so that's what the second design got. The optical design in the second edition stayed largely the same. I made the front bigger to add those larger protective bevels, but this didn't really stop cracking from happening. The new mount design itself actually caused some issues. Because I designed it sort of in a sandwich, with the cover plate sitting on top of the rear plate, which sits on top of the glass, and then the housing, whenever you apply pressure to the outside screws, it's transferred directly to the glass. This meant that in some cases, some people received the adapter with the back corners having cracked. I sent them out replacement glass, of course, but that doesn't help. That is still a bummer. And so here you can get a really, really up close view of a crack from a lens that a customer sent back to me. So you can see really that very obviously the pressure was transferred through this screw directly down in the corner onto this glass. A better way to design this would be so that the cover plate sits on the lip on the housing and the rear plate is smaller, so that the cover plate doesn't apply pressure directly onto the lens, but rather circumvents it and applies it to the housing. This also makes it more resistant to impacts. Since I already have a lot of housings, my roundabout way of solving this is making the rear lens thicker so it can endure more stress. This isn't ideal, but it should do fine. And so here's a close-up of this rear lens, right? And so you're seeing how thin this edge is. If I attempt to measure it, well, it's 0.84, I believe, in the calculations, but I guess it averages probably between 0.8 and 0.9 in real life. Might not look like much, but it is essentially twice as thick, right? One of the things you'll notice with this lens is that it is very, very slightly biconvex. And this was really sort of at the start of understanding the lens design software for me, where I think like if I had to redo this, I probably wouldn't get these lenses made the way I got them made. The original one is planar at the back and has a front radius that's around 49.97. And these are about 400 on the rear, probably 445, and then 56, I think, on the front. What does this do? Really adding this rear curvature, what it does is make the spherical aberration slightly less. And when I mean slightly, I mean very, very slightly. It like rectifies the chart, kind of, but spherical aberration was really never the limiting factor of this lens, more so astigmatism. And so it's probably worth just flattening this out, which I will probably do for the next batch of these. So they'll probably be flat again, but just thicker on the edge. Nick Simon, one of the people who actually pre-ordered the adapter and got the 3D files, is a mechanical engineer and reached out about some of these concerns. At that point, I had already ordered the parts. There wasn't much I could do, but wait and see if these sort of fears materialize into real issues, and some of them did. While I was assembling the adapter, I actually never had any issues with cracking. The only lens I cracked was one that cracked 2/3 of the way up next to one of the screws. And this was clearly because I screwed it down too hard. I never had one crack in the corners like people had through shipping. So that about does it for the mechanical issues with this adapter. What about the glass? The glass was a journey itself. I decided to switch manufacturers from the first to the second batch, mainly because I wanted to add anti-reflective coatings, and the first manufacturer were just too expensive. The manufacturer I originally went with sent me a really nice sample, which I approved, and then we went on to production. About 10 weeks later, they then ended up sending me what I could only describe as pure garbage. The lenses they sent had visible artifacts and flat spots, grinding marks, the coating wasn't fully made correctly. There was just no way I could sell anything like that. Actually, I still have the about 360 lenses that they sent me. I'll put some close-ups in of what they look like so you can see, but they are truly quite abysmal. I couldn't with a good conscience sell this to anybody, let alone use it. It's pretty much unusable. But they did end up refunding me for the glass, which sort of leads me to believe that this must have been an internal miscommunication somehow, as if they were truly out to scam me, they would have just cut contact. But after a few emails, they just agreed to send me my money back and just told me to keep the lenses. I didn't have to scramble to find a second manufacturer, or third manufacturer, which I did. This meant another 8 to 10 weeks of delay. When those arrived somewhere early November, I was really happy. I opened the box. The lenses looked great. I started assembling, putting them together. About 10 or 15 lenses in, I noticed that there was an issue on the front lens. By this point, I had already shipped out the lenses to Piero and Rich, who are assembling for the UK and US, and who are my sort of partners and collaborators on this project. The issue itself was that some of the front lenses, above half, had a missing part of the coating on the top edge. This, again, is something that's like a cosmetic issue overall, because it doesn't really affect the image itself all that much, or not very noticeably, because it's hidden mainly by the cover. But it's not something that I'd be willing to send to customers and just pretend that it's good. So in for a penny, in for a pound, we're back for a third round of manufacturing. The manufacturer quickly acknowledged the issue and said they were going to be remaking the lenses. But that was another 8 to 10 weeks of wait. And by this point, I then received the lenses late December, a couple days before Christmas. And so by early January, I ship out the lenses to Piero and Rich, and they can start assembling as well. So a project that originally would have been over in September stretched into the new year, into January, so about four months of delay. Um,
I'd never felt so blue as the night I saw you. I tried to see you once again underneath the Texas moon. I've got what I want, got what I need without you. Still, I would lay down on my knees under you.
all right, so lastly, what have we learned on the optics side? So the first edition was designed mainly using a very, very basic formula, and I used scripting in Grasshopper to do sort of the spacing calibration. This approach has its flaws, mainly that it doesn't consider really any of the types of aberrations, except maybe spherical. The code I was running in Grasshopper really checked whether the two marginal rays with the adapter were intersecting at the same point as they were without the adapter, which meant that it would basically just make sure that the adapter was afocal. The issue here is if you look at proper lens design software, something like Oslo, you would realize this approach really only basically assures you that the image is sharp in the center and nothing more. To understand why this is flawed, we're going to have to look at sort of the basic properties that make a lens good or bad, the aberrations. There are 5 cidal aberrations: spherical aberration, coma, astigmatism, distortion, curvature of field. Actually, there are 2 chromatic aberrations, which are longitudinal and lateral. An easier way to understand the cidal aberrations is like this. When the center and the edge rays don't hit at the same point along the axis, when the center and the edge rays don't hit the same point perpendicular to the axis, when the X and Y beams don't hit at the same point along the axis, when the focal length of the lens is not the same at the center as it is at the edges, and finally, curvature field, which some don't really consider to be an aberration like the others, is when something planar in the real world becomes curved in the image space. The reason some people won't see this as a proper aberration is that objects that are further away in the object space will be closer in the image space, which means that it's more of a property of how the lens works, but visually it looks like an aberration. Because an anamorphic adapter is essentially adding a piece of glass in front of an already corrected lens, it adds aberrations. Some of these, in moderation, can look pleasing. This lens has two main aberrations, astigmatism and distortion. The easiest way to understand astigmatism is that it's a difference in focus between the X and Y planes, usually called the sagittal and transverse. In an anamorphic, you're inherently changing the properties only in the transverse plane. So granted that the original lens already has some correction for astigmatism, you're basically adding two pieces of glass that will change the properties. In this case, widen the field of view, but that will throw off the focus in one axis. As for distortion, the easiest way to correct it is symmetry. If you put the same piece of glass in front and behind an aperture, you'll get a relatively well-corrected design for distortion. In fact, this is how most symmetrical wide angles work. Think topogon, superangular, biogon, grandagon. They're all symmetrical designs, somewhat. They make some modifications to correct for the other aberrations. Now back to the anamorphic. You're basically adding just a bunch of glass in front of the lens, which means inevitably you're adding some level of distortion. Now you can correct this with more glass, and by changing the curvatures, it's possible to get different types of distortion. For example, a really, really curved in front will usually give you more barrel distortion. As you push it positive, it will go over to pincushion. Now, in an anamorphic, it's added really only in one axis, so this is more so true barrel distortion, cylindrical, rather than sort of a spherical distortion. You have to think of lens design more as a game of equations. You have a certain amount of aberrations, and thus you need a certain amount of degrees of freedom to solve those equations. And in this case, with a design with only two curved surfaces and the spacing in the middle, we only really have 3 degrees of freedom. And so this design is really only optimized for 3 parameters, which is the squeeze ratio of 1.33x, minimizing spherical aberration, and minimizing astigmatism to the best of its ability. Just jumping in here, I think actually it'd be more correct to say that the 2 surfaces and the spacing are used for firstly maintaining the squeeze ratio, and then 2, just focusing the adapter, right? You could say it minimizes spherical and astigmatism, but really what I'm trying to mean here is that you're placing those curves at the 0 point so that in the center they are correct, right? And by moving those curvatures around, you could sort of tweak the astigmatism for it to be a better overall picture or more sharp in the center. If we now switch to the lens itself, okay, same me, different day, different camera. I had to put this on the Voigtlander color scope R that only mounts on my GFX. That's the only camera I have for it. I don't actually have a lens that will fit the adapter on this Blackmagic camera. So what you can see is that there is some curvature of the field, right? I don't think the Kim Wipes box is quite in focus, but somewhere around there's some curvature. And this indicates because the field is curving like this here, it's curving the opposite way in the camera, which means that on the side, objects closer than your subject should be in focus. Additionally, you'll see some barrel distortion in the image, which is, as we discussed, a change in the magnification according to the sort of the height or the distance from the center of the lens. One last thing I also found out while using proper design software like Oslo is that my spacing calculations were slightly off as well. The adapter comes with this little card that gives you the information on how to space the elements if you want to shim it or build your own housing. The card says that it's optimized for 3 meters. It's probably closer to 1 to 1.5 meter on most of the adapters. Since I discovered this, I have been shimming them up to 3 meters. So you should be able to tell by looking at your adapter whether it's been shimmed or not. It will have this extra piece of plastic that pushes the lens forward. But this also means that luckily for you, if you were targeting a different focal length or a different spacing, well, you have more space. You're close to the 1 meter mark, and so you just have to make a little plastic piece. If you have a 3D printer, this should be pretty easy. There'll be files available on the website for you to use. For to do this a bit more simply. and also an updated chart that fixes sort of the spacing. Okay, so I think that's all for this video. This little section here is being recorded on the bad version of the glass. I feel like it's a bit of a shame to do nothing with these lenses. I have so many of them available. They are all terrible, genuinely, as you can probably tell. But if you're interested or you just want to support and have a paperweight, I think I'll make something out of them. So probably an adapter that just has the bad glass in it. It's probably going to be cheaper, probably 3D printed housing and all of the added accoutrement. So that if you want to support me and the project, then you can do so. I also have plenty of the actual adapters left, the ones with not bad glass. If you're interested in those, and those are also on the website. I think I have about maybe 40 or 50 housings left, and I have a bunch of glass in case people break some. Yeah, if you have supported this project up till now, if you ordered one, first of all, I'm very sorry for the delays. As I hope you can tell, I did my best to keep things on track, but it wasn't always within my powers. And yeah, it's helped me sort of devote more time to this passion and hobby of mine. I've been able to rent out a tiny little space that I can store all these parts in and do all the building from, which has been really, really helpful to not have to do it in my room anymore, which is nice when you have, 100 or 200 adapters to build. It's nice to be able to sort of separate that and not have to do it next to where you sleep. So yeah, thank you so much. I hope to make some more videos in the future about the other cameras and other projects that I have and sort of revive some of them. But yeah, see you next time.